So the question that is commonly asked is, what makes for a better movie? What makes for a better story? Does the character-driven storyline, is that better? Is that the better way to approach storytelling? Or maybe the plot, to think about your story from the point of view of the plot. Now, this is a classic question that's been around since like the dawn of time. When I went to NYU, this was a big question that all the students would debate. If you're writing a story, the kind of movies that really are more meaningful and deep and complex, those are character-driven stories. And the thinner, more action-oriented stories, those are plot-driven stories. Now, the real answer to the question is that it's neither. The answer to the question, the correct answer, in my opinion, is that the answer is characters, not character. Characters, namely plural characters. That is what makes for a great, awesome, incredible story and movie. Now, this obviously requires some explanation. Now, the real flaw of the question is that it's suggestive that one is more important than the other, that there's a primary and secondary, that either the plot is primary and therefore the character, and when it says character, it means the main character, is secondary, or perhaps the main character is primary and therefore the plot is secondary. And this way of thinking about story is actually a fundamental flaw that most writers fall into, because the correct answer, as I already said, is characters. So let me explain what I mean by characters. See, when we think about stories, one of the mistakes we make, most writers make this mistake, is they think about the beginning of the story begins, and they've got a character who has a background, an ordinary world that is flowing into that reality, and now they're going to deal with a situation. So there's usually a setup period where we introduce the character in their ordinary world, and then something happens. Now that's something that happens at what we call the inciting incident. That's a situation. There's a situation that takes place. Now what we see going on in great stories is that character who is introduced at the beginning of a story, that's the character. And then the situation would be the plot. Now all stories have both. You have to have both. But again, the correct answer is characters, neither character nor plot. So I'm going to bring it to my answer. But the way we incorrectly think about story is that we've got this main character who's moving into your story, going through the introduction or the setup. They come to an inciting incident. Now there's a situation. And now they're focused on addressing whatever the situation is. And that leads to Act 2 and eventually to a climax and resolution at Act 3. This is a fundamentally flawed way of thinking about story. And like what I'd like to do right now is an answer to the question, what's more important, a character-driven story or a plot-driven story, is explain to you a way of thinking about story that will give you such enormous, amazing clarity and a better way to think about your stories. You see, what's really going on in great stories is you've got your main character or protagonist flowing from their reality. They've got a reality that they exist in. And that reality flows into the now. The now is the story you're telling. And the setup period of a movie is just revealing enough of the details of that reality that's flowing into your story in order to frame who this character is and why they are going to be what I call uniquely extraordinary for what's about to happen. Now you get to what is called the inciting incident. I don't call it the inciting incident in my system. We refer to it as the situation, which is either typically a problem or an opportunity. There is a third thing. I was the first one to really introduce this idea of problem or opportunity rather than an inciting incident, which I did with my mega course back in 2010. And now pretty much everybody talks about the idea of a problem or opportunity. But there's actually a third thing, which I don't talk about so much anymore. But for the most part, it's a problem or opportunity, but we just say there's a situation. Now, what's really unique about the situation does not exist in a vacuum. If we step out of the focus of the main character and we think about the situation, that situation has a reality of its own. That situation has a history of its own. That situation is flowing through time, parallel to your main character. So imagine this is your main character flowing from the past into the now where you're going to tell your story. That's their reality. Now there's also a second reality. That is the situation's reality. The thing that's going to cause the problem or opportunity for your main character has a history, and it's flowing in parallel. And what happens at your inciting incident is they converge. That's what happens at an inciting incident. There's two major flowing parallel storylines. One, the main characters. And a second is this other story. And that other story, with almost very few exceptions, very rare that there's an exception. So it's almost never, but with very few exceptions, that flowing second reality that's going to become the main plot, that's going to cause the situation to your main character, that has a second character attached to it. In my system, we call that character the proximate cause character. That character, the reality is that second situation that's flowing in parallel to your main character, and that's going to converge, has a character attached to it, has a character who has an agenda, has a character who is dependent on the outcome. That the outcome of that second timeline matters. And this is where, and then it flows, both realities flow into the now of your story. And they converge at what is traditionally called the inciting incident. And then from that point forward, they move forward together. You see, you have both. A character, who's your main character, and a plot, but the plot is never a thing on its own. A plot is driven by a second character. And that second character we call the proximate cause character, not to be confused with an antagonist. Often it is the antagonist, but it's not always the antagonist. It can be, and it oftentimes is the antagonist, but it's not always. I want to be clear. That's why in my system we refer to it as the proximate cause character. But that proximate cause character has their own history, has their own reality, has their own agenda, has their own desires. That's characters. Two characters. There's actually potentially a third and a fourth other major characters, but we're not talking about those right now. This is the proximate cause characters, reality flowing and driving what I call the A story, or that plot-based story, the situation-based story. And then you've got your main character, what I call the B story. And that main character drives that B story and that foundational framework upon which your movie takes place. Now, people who say what's more important is the character-driven story, what they're talking about is the main character's reality, that main character driving that reality, but that's not enough. And the people who say, oh, the plot-driven stories are more important, no. What they're talking about is that A story and that proximate cause character flowing and pushing into the story, but they're not thinking about that proximate cause character. What they're thinking about is only the situation that's going to happen to the main character. And what you need to do is you have to back up from both characters. You have to really know the relevant, meaningful, important history of your main character, your protagonist, as that reality flows into the now of your story. And you have to know the reality and the agenda and the situation and the history, the relevant history of that proximate cause character who is pushing forward the agenda that becomes the A story and the plot, and that ultimately converges with your main character. And that's how you create and craft genuine, great, amazing, interesting stories.